Afternoon, all of you, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for what we think is going to be an incredibly exciting webinar. My name is Ruth McCambridge, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly. Today's topic is Reframing Nonprofit Leadership Succession, the Ultimate Strategic Hedge Against a Bad CEO Hire. And when I talk about a bad CEO hire, you know what I mean because you've seen it. They're not uncommon in the nonprofit sector, nor for that matter in the for-profit sector. But in the nonprofit sector, it can be truly excruciating because even with very robust collective structures that have achieved great things over the years, you can see the frailty underneath in the way that executive director hires are structured. And so what we're going to try to do today is just to look at a different way entirely of approaching the idea of leadership succession. Is it simply the replacement of one executive leader or another, or is it something really entirely different that may include that replacement, but is certainly not the be-all and end-all? So I want to, the workshop today is going to include a couple of case studies, which are going to really highlight some of the principles of practice that we're trying to recommend as replacements for the way people are approaching this very important moment right now in their own nonprofits. The two experts who will be joining us today in this workshop are Jeanne Bell of CompassPoint and Karen Schuler of Raffa PC. Jeanne Bell is the executive officer at CompassPoint. As the CEO of CompassPoint, Jeanne leads an integrated practice of 24 people who use teaching, coaching, consulting, peer learning, and research to advance social equity work in the Bay Area. Karen Schuler is the managing director of Search, Transition, and Planning at Raffa PC in DC. Karen leads Raffa's practice focused on nonprofit leadership and organizational planning. Tom and Jeanne will be joined today by a number of panelists. They are Jennie Lucca, CEO of the Children's Inn at NIH, Diane Baker, board member of Children's Inn at NIH, and Susan Misra, co-director at the Management Assistance Group, or as it's more commonly called, MAG. The webinar is going to be recorded, so don't ask me a million times if the webinar will be recorded, because it will be, and we're going to send it to you right after we finish it or by the next day. So we're going to make all of the PowerPoint slide accessible and the recording accessible to you directly, and then it will be available on our website from then on. We are going to leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So if you think of one at any point during this presentation, just go ahead and log it in. It may be that it's going to be answered during the presentation, but it'll keep me abreast of what it is that you guys are curious about. And so I can, at the end, sort through those questions and ask the ones that are most relevant. The questions can be asked on the right-hand side of your screen in the questions area. The other thing that we'd like to just alert you to is that all of our workshops like this are tracked on social media. So today's event is tracked under the hashtag on Twitter of #SmartTransition. Please help us to make sure that people know that this is going on so that they can come and access the event later. And with that, I want to say I really do feel like this workshop is part of a real shift in practice in terms of executive transitions and leadership succession in organizations more generally. And between between Jeanne Bell and Tom Adams, they have pushed at this agenda for a solid, what, year and a half now, Jeanne?
We have.
Really making sure that it was clear and understandable and illustrated by real practice examples. And so what you're getting today is the result of some very intensive work from people who have been doing this kind of work for probably 2 decades. Okay, so with that, I will hand it to you, Jeanne.
Thank you so much, Ruth. And Karen Schuler from Raffa, I just want to give you a chance to introduce yourself since we keep referencing Tom, who's been my colleague on this, but just for you to say hi.
Hi, delighted to be here with you. Tom and I have worked together for over 10 years, and I'm delighted to be here on the webinar.
Great. And for how we're going to structure this is Karen and I are going to lay out for the premise for the work. As Ruth said, Raffa and CompassPoint have been working really for a couple of years on this, studying our own experiences, listening to other practitioners, and observing what we see as kind of a shift in the discourse about how we think about executive transition in nonprofit organizations. This work has been supported by the Casey Foundation, the Packard Foundation, and by both of our organizations investing a lot in terms of a learning agenda around how do we want to support a broadening out of the dialogue about how we think about executive transition. So what we'll do is we'll share some thoughts about that, and then we'll do 2 case studies, the Children's Inn and Management Assistance Group, very different organizations from a mission perspective, but interestingly, they do both really reflect this widening out that we're talking about in terms of thinking beyond single leader transition. And then we'll share a couple of reflections about what those case studies both teach us, and then Ruth's going to moderate, hopefully, a really rich Q&A with you all. So let's start with the premise here, and this slide pretty much captures what we're suggesting that needs to be thought about at the board and staff level in organizations, and that is being thought about, but maybe not as consciously and collectively as is possible. What we're saying here is that we know leadership transition, the bottom circle there, is around what it is. It's around preparing for what we estimate is about 10% executive turnover annually across the sector. So that's a lot of organizations preparing for new leadership and going through the process of recruitment, developing, succession planning, et cetera. The things that we've been talking about for at least 2 decades in the sector, a lot. And still there's a lot of art and skill just to that, just to the notion of how are we preparing for leadership transition. One of the premises we're making is that leadership transition today, I think, is more often seen as part of larger organizational transitions. And that's that middle circle, where this is more, in my opinion, than just within a leadership transition, the first couple months doing a strategic review or something like that as a best practice, but rather seeing leadership transition as running alongside, really significant evolutions in organizations. And that's that proactive refining of organizational strategy and business model, and also the adaptation of organizational culture and systems, so that the leadership transitions, not just the executive, by the way, board leadership transitions, senior staff transitions, executive transition, are better seen as kind of part and parcel to how an organization is continuously evolving. And then we're kind of adding a third piece to that, which is our understanding of leadership itself is evolving. And for the purposes of our conversation, we're going to call that the evolving leadership ethos. And for us, this is about challenging our organizations on who leads, right, sort of demographically, et cetera, and with what leadership beliefs and practices are they bringing to leadership. Because we would posit that over the 25 years that executive transition management as a best practice has appropriately gotten solidified in our sector, our attitudes and beliefs about leadership have changed over those 25 years. So how do we take all of those things, in preparation, succession planning, really monitoring the need for organizational transition, and whatever the evolving ethos about leadership is in your organization or in your field or movement, and think about those holistically as potentially self-reinforcing kinds of transitions rather than separate issues entirely. That's the premise. And I'm going to turn it to Karen now to talk a little bit about how executive transition management has broadened out to think about organizational transition.
So the evolution of executive transition management mirrors the evolution in our thinking and understanding when we look at leadership transitions, organizational transitions, and the leadership ethos. I think one of the fundamental values that we all have around this work is that wherever those transition or planning engagements are occurring, the fundamental value is how do we ensure that we are sustaining high mission impact. So it's the mission of the organization that remains at the heart of the work. And what we know is that leadership transition, executive search and transition doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens certainly at a particular point in time because an executive is ready to leave or there's some type of transition at the board. But allied with that executive transition are sustainability and succession planning. So these are concepts of looking at our leadership and paying attention to leadership development and best practices in terms of succession planning, and also thinking about sustainability planning, which is less about sustaining an organization, but more about taking a look at the business model and the resources so that we can be sustaining the mission and the work of the organization. And those are some of the additional services that we've added to our practice as our practice has grown. So when we take a look at leadership and organizational transitions, there are four fundamental terms that we think about. Executive search and transition, and this is more than just the looking for your next executive. We think about executive transition starting when the current executive has decided that they're ready to start thinking about their next step and all of the preparation that the organization moves through before launching the search, then the search activities themselves, and then on the end of that, the onboarding work, the early work with the new executive to get him or her into a good relationship with the board and moving forward. Succession planning, this is an interesting term. We find that a lot of people have different understandings of succession planning. From our perspective, succession planning is helping an organization think about leadership development and leadership continuity so that the organization can deftly manage either planned or unplanned changes in leadership. It may involve internal succession and it may involve interim support. Sustainability planning. This is paying attention to the long-term mission of the organization and focusing on the four components of sustainability. The leadership, which is your board and your staff, strategy and business model, how the organization goes about advancing its mission, the culture of the organization, and the resources. And resources is everything from the dollars and the physical plants and facilities to volunteer corps, brand, visibility. And then I think the fourth area of organizational transition is strategic planning. And this is an annual high-level review of the mission and the strategic goals of the organization, and then tying that strategic planning to your annual planning and your leadership development. So those are some of the terms that support leadership and organizational transition.
Great, thank you. And then if we add on that third outer bubble around leadership ethos, and this is to get, we're all using sort of common vocabulary about the various elements of transition. We decided to call this ethos because as an executive myself and as someone who's been in leadership development for 20 years, I'm experiencing personally and witnessing other people experience a very profound shift in some of our assumptions about, again, who leads, what a leader is, what are the qualities of a leader, what are the expectations of a leader, how is leadership conducted. We talked for a long time in the 90s and early 2000s about the hero leader and the martyr leader and scarcity, but we didn't talk as much about what to replace it with. And I think in the last 5-10 years, we've done more exploration there. Using a term, for instance, like shared leadership, which of course, has lots of different manifestations, but the ethos question being, how do we genuinely distribute leadership more broadly in our organizations? How do we be leaderful? How do we be a place that next generation leaders can step not in 20 or 30 years, but in 4 or 5 years into profound leadership? certainly questions of diversity. And I think, for many of us, this goes beyond, our board doesn't look like our clients or our, it goes much beyond that to issues of equity. So certainly diversity, but also what are the practices that are actually just and fair that a multiracial organization puts in place to be really careful and thoughtful about its procedures, its processes, who gets opportunities, how their resources are distributed. I think a lot of organizations are thinking very deeply about this, certainly beyond the single executive, but more as what in general do we think about leadership in our organization? And that's why we're calling it an ethos. It's really a set of beliefs. And I think organizations need to be reflecting on that, especially as they prepare for organizational and executive transition. Where do we want to see leadership itself in our organizations? And the quote below is actually from an article written by MAG, who's our second case study today. But from their perspective, they're talking about a different kind of leadership required in a social justice context, moving from competition to collaboration, from single issues to intersectionality, from scarcity to abundance. And that just gives you a sense, I think, of the kind of language we're hearing and the kind of revisiting of what does it mean even to be an executive director in an organization that's trying to support social change, for instance. And can our leadership better reflect both the values and the practices that we're trying to promote external to the organization? That's what we mean by ethos. And we recognize that for some organizations, that may be a narrower question about a generational handoff. For some organizations, it may be more complex and political. It may be about how do we become a racially just organization or a more equitable organization. And we know that you on the call and out in the world, people are on all different kind of points on that continuum, but wherever you are, the question of what kind of leadership do we want to promote and who do we want to promote and how do we want to support them needs to be part of the equation, we would argue. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Karen to bring our first story to us of the Children's Inn and what we learn about these various levels of transition from their story.
Great, thank you, Jeanne. I'm delighted to be here today with Jennie Lucca, the CEO of the Children's Inn at NIH, and Diane Baker, a board member at the Children's Inn. I think one of the fascinating pieces about the Children's Inn is that the story that you all have, the journey that you've taken over the past 10 years, 12 years, right, is about transition both at the executive level, transition at the board level, at the organizational level, and also about transitioning founding generations of leaders. And that's contributed to the evolution, I think, of leadership here at the Children's Inn. So, Jennie, maybe you could start off by telling us, sharing with our listeners a little bit about the mission and work of the Children's Inn.
Sure, thank you. I'm really pleased to join you today and excited to share our experience with leadership transition. The Children's Inn at NIH is a nonprofit organization located in Bethesda, Maryland, and our mission is to provide lodging and support services free of charge to seriously ill children and their families who are traveling from all around the world and all around the United States to participate in medical research trials at the National Institutes of Health, and otherwise known as the NIH, and that is why the NIH is in our name. The NIH is actually a federal institution, a government institution. It is where all the biomedical research happens. So it is on this campus where scientists and clinicians are finding new cures and treatments that then are spread to people all over the world. So the kiddos that come to us, often it's their last best hope. They've exhausted all of their options in their home states, in their home countries, and they're participating in research with the hope that they will find a new treatment or a new cure, and they're medical pioneers in a sense, because then they're spreading that to the next person diagnosed with the same disease.
Great. If we look at the milestone chart, can you tell us a little bit, Jennie, from the CEO perspective, where the leadership transition started with the Children's Inn at NIH?
Sure, and to do that, I should tell you a little bit about myself and my own journey at the Children's Inn. So I'm in my third year as CEO, but I've been with the organization for 14 years. So I was an internal candidate. My predecessor, Kathy Russell, was a founding member of this organization, and the Inn was founded in 1990. So we're in our 27th year, if I do my math correctly, which is probably a date I should know. And so she went from a founding member to she then became CEO around 2005, and she was the CEO for 10 years before her retirement. And so, formally, I think it started around 2012. She retired at the end of 2014, but really prior to that, she was doing a lot of informal development of key people in this organization. And I really give her the credit as a leader, and she's passed on to me that a value for her and our organization is to continually to develop leaders, whether you're developing them for a position within your organization or a position in another organization. So informally, she was doing that along the way, and we were working together on career growth for me. But around that 2012 timeframe, she started to really think about what retirement, and didn't quite know when it would happen, but knowing that Diane was really very personally important to her because she was a founder and professionally as well. So she went to Transition Guide's
a workshop for executives thinking about next steps.
That's right. And it was at that point, I think, that she realized, there's a lot more to this. You don't just give 6 months or even a year notice and pass it on to the board and say, good luck. Hope you find a great new person. She knew that she had a very important role to play, and so she worked with the board, of course, in the Transition Guide to begin the transition of setting the organization up to prepare for an eventual transition.
Great. And so, Diane, there was simultaneously some transition going on at the board level, because I think we had almost a founding generation of board members. Talk to us a little bit about that transition or evolution.
Okay, sure. Well, hello, everyone. We're all glad to be here with you. Yes, Kathy's right. We had become a board with no retirement. We did add new members, and occasionally members chose to retire on their own, but we did really have very much a founder board. And as I think someone at the time said, after so many years, we've exhausted everyone's Rolodex. We had also, I think, recognized, or maybe we recognized a little later, we've gotten in the habit that a family gets into, which we approach the problem solving, each of us in our repetitive manner of approaching the problem solving, whatever it was. There wasn't an influx of fresh ideas or new tools or resources. And we recognized that it was really time to discipline ourselves and impose term limits and really look at a mechanism for invigorating our board with new members and living to the commitment that we were going to serve a term and then we were going to graciously resign. So we recognized we had gotten to a point where it became necessary that we had to take this on. And I think some of our board members were on board and some were thinking, oh, that won't involve me. So I think we were across the gamut in terms of how we reacted. I happened to be involved in the transition committee that got formed and took this on.
And did the timing of the transition for the board, the reorganization, the almost succession planning, if you will, at the board level, where did that occur relative to Kathy's decision that she was starting to think about her own transition?
Right.
Yeah, they started at the same time.
Okay.
It really happened. Her thinking about retirement and her working with the board really happened simultaneously.
And share with our listeners how the Children's Inn decided, whether it was with Kathy's impetus or the board input, I'm sure, how you all decided how to approach Kathy's transition. If you were going to manage it yourself, because we've seen that occur, or if you were going to get outside help, and the timing of all of that. How did that come about?
Right. Well, we did decide we were going to have outside help, and I think that was a wise decision on our part. And we ended up working with Raffa, and it was a very educational, informative, and productive relationship. And as part of that, I think we had several moving pieces. I think we had Kathy's succession planning going, we had the board transition piece going, and the board transition piece, I think the board did step up and own that, and we sort of took that on, and we actually worked with another consultant from one of our board members' companies who really helped us think about how do you do this in a gracious way and not leave, so to speak, bodies out the door. And it ended up that the timeline of 1 year that we put aside, and we had a timeline of 3 years. And we did a long listening tour with our donors, with our other board members, with the board members, as we looked at the timeline, who would be departing and rolling off first and second and third. And it was an amazing process. It really was thoughtful and worked well. It took longer than we had initially expected to invest in it, but it worked very well, very well.
Great. And can you talk a little bit about how the organization made that decision that they wanted to consider an internal successor for Kathy? Because I think that's an important. I think that's a big decision both for the executive who's leaving. I think it's a big decision for the board, and I think it's a big decision for the internal candidate. So, from the board perspective, talk a little bit about that, Diane, and then we'll hear from Jennie.
Sure. As a member of that committee that was looking at the recruitment of a new CEO, we were working with Tom Adams, and I think the committee all came into it with the assumptions that wouldn't surprise you, like, oh, we're going to do a broad search, we're going to cast a large net, we're going to find the most talented person, and we're going to have a great recruitment. And it somehow trickled into our consciousness that actually there was a great internal candidate, and there was, I think this really came through Kathy, a very wise leader, who said you really should look at the internal candidate first. And I remember we had a session with Tom, just our committee, not Kathy, not Jennie, just Tom and this committee. And Tom was introducing this idea of interview the internal candidate before you even look at other candidates. And he really had a thoughtful approach about why in our situation, in our culture, in our setting, that was something to consider. And I remember the anxiety, we were all like, but that's not the way you do it. And I sort of at that moment, Tom could have kind of, leaned forward and said, look, guys, you have some options here, and here's what you should look at. And he did this thing, I remember this. He leaned back. He didn't disengage, but he was relaxed. And he said, well, let's talk about the options. And what it said to me is, we have time. We can be thoughtful. We don't have to rush. Let's talk this through, and I'm going to help you talk it through. And it, for me anyway, it just relaxed me. It's like, okay, we're going to talk about a totally different way to proceed. Let's have that conversation. So he became this trusted participant in our committee because he never seemed to have an agenda, but he was invested in a process, and we joined him in that. He brought us along in that. I think I had said once before, there were occasionally times when he would push back on us. Are you really thinking about that? Let's think this through in terms of consequences, unintended consequences. He really brought a rigor to our consideration of issues that was helpful and reinforced our trust in the process he was guiding us through.
That's great. And it sounds as though the process was one that really aligned with the values and the culture and the priorities of the organization. So Jennie, from your perspective as the internal candidate, tell us a little bit about that journey for you.
Sure. I mentioned that Kathy and I had started far before developing me for some role, and it became more clear to me that leading an organization at some point in my career was something that I wanted to do, and so that's really where my plan started. And Dee and I would work on the skills that I would need to develop, and then Once she identified me as a potential candidate for the Children's Den, and we had a very, very direct conversation about that, about if it were me, what I would need to develop, where my skills needed to be enhanced. We put a plan together, and for me, it was certainly an interesting experience. I would say that I've to people out there listening, I was lucky enough to be with a predecessor and a board who were incredibly transparent about the process. There were no surprises. I was brought into the conversation when it was appropriate, and I was, left out when the board really did need to process through their own feelings and experiences that really had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with, well, isn't it a search, a wide net search better for this organization, or is an internal candidate, not Jennie, the internal candidate? That I really didn't come along until right before, I went through a regular interview process when we got to the deadline of actually Kathy retiring. But prior to that, it was more about, Tom's work was more about which direction do we want to go. So for me, I knew that either way, I really couldn't lose. I was either going to be selected to be the CEO of the Children's Inn, or I was going to be well prepared to lead another organization. So that was enough for me to take that risk and take that leap of faith.
So can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
Because I think it's critical to understanding this. So our committee, and through the committee, our entire board, went from being cast the widest net to there is an important justification for proceeding with this option of interviewing solely the internal candidate, going through a full interview process, but with the internal candidate, and then decide, do we need anything more? And we were able to convince the board. So we went into this interview with a unanimous agreement from our board that this was the process. And it was not the process we expected to undertake, but we were unanimous in doing it.
That's great. And so in leading up to the process, did succession planning and sustainability planning factor into some of the decision-making around what was important to the Children's Inn?
Yeah, and so that was really the work that we did also with the consultant. And I think I mentioned this earlier, that we did a lot of planning before we even got to the point of leadership succession. And part of that planning was looking at the organization, looking at all the departments within our organization, looking at our leadership positions and unpacking those jobs, looking at each of the areas to see if we needed to build some capacity, which we did. We did need to hire some new employees. We looked at our board, we looked at our cadre of volunteers, and just really did a deep dive into what do we need to do before we can even think about a leadership transition. And so all that happened leading up to the day Kathy announced that she was ready to kind of start the process.
Great. And then one of the things that we always know is that a transition is not completed once the new CEO has stepped into the position. There's always some onboarding work that's helpful, and I think this is probably also true in terms of board succession planning and board transition, being able to do some of the board orientation and development work. So tell us a little bit about what that looked like for the Children's Inn.
Yeah, the same group that was the search and transition committee then transitioned, once I was promoted to CEO, into what was called an onboarding committee, and that was probably one of the smartest things we did as an organization. I think it provided a safety net for me as a new executive, some reassurance to the board to know that they were supported as well. We continued with our consultant then, so he actually became part of that process as well, and just made sure that we were looking around corners, helped me develop a 90-day plan. I think he attended a couple of our board meetings and reported on how it was going. I remember him saying, "You're in the honeymoon phase now. You're giving her a nice, giving her the space, Jennie, the space she needs to really set up her house. But I promise you, in 2 years, your expectations are going to go high, and I hope you're going to expect her to meet your expectations, which has actually happened as well." So I think he was really good about just helping us see, see the future and see what potentially could be some obstacles in that process. But that onboarding committee, and then Kathy also was continued to be a mentor to me as well in those first many months too. She was part of that process.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo what you're saying, because I think as these various tasks, sort of the interviewing, the onboarding, the succession planning, it's easy to then just stay focused on that bubble of timeline and issue. And I think Tom had this ability to say, okay, that's good. Now let's think about what happens 3 years from now and 5 years from now. And you don't have the plan, but where would you like to be? What are your targets? What's the network you're going to need? What are the resources? And he just always had this way of dipping back into the bigger picture. And that was helpful.
Right, right. So it's interesting, because I think as we are listening to both of you all talk about the enormous transition that the Children's Inn has been through, from a founder executive and a founding board, through board transition and leadership transition, through succession planning, sustainability planning, it's really advanced the organization. So as you think about how the leadership has changed or evolved through all of these processes, what are your takeaways?
Okay. I like what you said earlier.
Well, I think one of the things, and honestly, I am focused on the consultant, because we were a board like a family. We knew who we trusted. We knew who we thought said the same thing. So when Tom comes into this environment and he's trustworthy and he has this broader viewpoint, he was basically modeling leadership for us. He was modeling a broader form of leadership, not just from your area of strength, but from embracing all the issues the organization needs to deal with. So I think the process, well, maybe not intended to, it caused all of us as board members to step up and step out of our comfort zone and step into leadership of the whole organization. I'm not the finance person, but I understand how that is part of my responsibility more than ever before. So I think that these processes, I think that's part of having a vigorous turnover in your board. It makes you step up or get out in a way. And I don't mean that in a brutal sense. I mean, that's what the organization needs. And that's what it was calling on us for. And we had not been hearing that call, which is part of the reason why we're in the situation we were in.
Right, right.
So I think we stepped up with a big change.
Great.
And I've stayed there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. You know, I'm a first-time CEO, and so they went from a very experienced, very seasoned executive to really a brand new executive. And at the time, as we've told you, it was a founding board. Kathy, my predecessor, these were her peers. These were the people that she really built this organization with. And so they really relied on her and had an enormous amount of trust to lead this organization, really both at the board level and at the staff level. But with me came something different. With me and needing to learn and to grow, they really had to be there with me and not take direction from me, or me be there to serve them, but really to be partners. And that was a major shift in the way I think we started to lead this organization, which perhaps is typical when you move from a founding board to a strategic fundraising board. But that shift has caused us to make changes at all levels in the organization. Board meetings are run very differently. They're much more about strategic conversations and not reporting. And my own leadership team is, and Kathy did start this, but we've evolved it to a culture of leadership, a culture of shared leadership also at the staff level. So I think you hit right on it, that it's the leadership culture that's evolved really in quite a beautiful way, and kept the mission at the forefront, so everybody can get on board with that.
Right, fabulous. Diane, talk to us a little bit about the new initiative at the board level around diversity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yes, about a year ago, the board took on the fact that we don't have a lot of diversity or inclusion within our boardroom. And I think that because we had done this work with succession planning, done the work with leadership development, and done the work with our own transition, that we had a foundation now, and we could take on something like this. because this is really about your leadership ethos too, as your earlier slide said. And in fact, we created our president as an ad hoc committee because it said you need to do this work and go away because the board needs to own this. This can't be a committee. The board needs to own this. So we are going to do a report out actually this week at our board retreat. And then we have a couple more months to write our final report after we get some board input on the work we've done. So I think we're all pretty excited that we have taken this on and that we have some targets of work we're going to do, and it's going to affect us in our donor relations, in our fundraising efforts, in our board recruitment. It's going to have effects at many levels throughout the organization.
Great. As both of you look back on this process, is there one moment in the process where you went, we're doing this the right way?
What a great question.
Because what we know is the right way is not the same, right? For every organization, every board, every executive.
Right. Well, I think I probably had a couple of those moments. I know one of them was in interviewing Jennie and seeing her through different eyes because of the context that she's our target and I want her to be our target, and I saw her differently and I listened differently and I thought this is the right way to do this. That was one of those moments.
Yeah, and maybe I think for me, because I was part of the process, but not making those decisions. For me, it's more been hindsight,
right?
So for me, I think it's going into the position, and I've said this before. I would say I was about 80% ready for the position, and I remember having some fear about that, and Kathy saying, "Well, you're never going to be 100%, so just go, like we prepared you as much as you can. You're going to be okay." And I just thought, okay, I hope I'll be okay. And you know what? I've been just fine. And I think the reason why we did it the right way is because of the process. I'm just fine because of the process and because of the support that I continue to feel, because we were all very prepared for this, because when we do have problems or issues that arise, that set the tone, I think, for how to get through those. So I think I've defined I know that now because of the success that we're having.
Great.
That's what I would say.
Great. So, Jennie and Diane, thank you so much for talking about the leadership transition, the organization transition, the evolving leadership ethos at the Children's Inn at NIH.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. This is Jeanne stepping back in and inviting Susan Misra, a co-director of MAG, to join now and share this story. Thank you for doing so, Susan. And can you just give us a brief overview of what MAG does today? We'll talk a little bit about what it used to do and its transition, but how would you describe the organization today?
Well, we're very vision driven, so we believe in a world where the people and planet experience love, dignity, and justice. And we do programmatic work where we convene people to think about what are the conditions we need to have in place in order to bring about that vision, and to do actual labs and experiments to bring about those conditions. And we also are consulting, have a consulting arm, and the consulting arm does strategy, racial equity processes, organizational culture change, and we work with movement networks, which we it's when multiple organizations come together in order to develop strategies and coordinate work towards a values-based result.
Great, thank you. And we'll learn more about that as we go along. So just give the listeners a chance to kind of take in your transition milestones and timeline. It's a different kind of story, but as I said in the opening, there are some similar elements in that organizational transition was reinforced by executive transition and vice versa, and certainly your ultimate decision to do co-directorship demonstrates some experimentation and willingness to explore the leadership ethos. Can you speak briefly, if folks look at this timeline, there's at the very beginning, there's something that we couldn't have known by now, but the fact of the matter is that both you and your current co-director, Alyssa Perry, were students of shared leadership models way before you could have known you'd be shared leaders together. Can you just speak to that briefly so we have a little sense of your background?
Sure. Alyssa Perry, my co-director, she is an educator, and we were doing a consulting project together with 40 organizations in California, and those organizations really wanted to look at shared leadership structures because their executive directors were very stressed out, and they were trying to figure out how can we share the burden of leadership and distribute it across leadership teams and with our boards. And Alyssa and I got to work together on that project for 3 years, actually, and wrote a paper on what those organizations had learned about sharing leadership.
Great, thank you so much. So tell us a little bit about the organizational change. As you can see here, there was in 2014, you had both kind of relatively in the same time zone, the existing executive stepping down for her own reasons, and the board and staff I think jointly coming to the conclusion that the organization needed a transition. Can you describe what was going on there and what that amounted to?
Sure. I mean, I thought the other case study around board development being one of the first areas of organizational evolution was really interesting. For us, we were going through re-looking at our strategy and our business model. So we do that. We've been around for 35 years. So every 5 years or so, we look back at our strategy and our business model and say, are we relevant still? Should we exist? How should we actually function in the world to bring about justice? And so this process we started with the board was really looking at the idea that right now in the United States, being a consulting organization and having earned income revenue and serving one organization at a time was not sufficient to actually bringing about a different type of world. And so we had embarked on this question of, well, if that's the case, what should we do differently? And we had actually hired a consultant who was an expert in design thinking and innovation to lead us in a very different way of doing strategy so that we could break through old ideas of what we thought the problems were and who we thought we were serving and come up with a new design for our organization.
Oh, great. And you were on staff at that time, right? Both you and Alyssa.
Yes, we were both on staff at that time. And our executive director decided to step down due to personal reasons. She's still involved with Meg in different ways. But that led to the board simultaneous to the strategic planning, business planning, design thinking process. They at the same time had to grapple with, well, who should be the next leader of MAG? And I think they approached it in the same way that the Children's Inn approached it, which is they first started with the idea that they would do an external search. It was reinforced by the thinking that MAG was going to do a major pivot to MAG 2.0, and it would become a programmatic organization that was doing more work on that was substantive in nature and would require fundraising. And so the board thought, well, we need an executive director who has a lot of fundraising connections and is really good at entrepreneurship and who can really pick our organization. So they wanted to go external. That was their original thinking back in 2015, is do a major external search and find somebody that could lead that transition.
Right, and then also they're having to deal with interim executive, and in your organization, a current board member agreed to serve as interim executive.
Yes.
Right.
Well, and I'm sorry, Gail couldn't attend right now, but she will be on the next one.
Right.
But Gail was a board member, and when Robin stepped down, she actually agreed to become the interim executive director in order to actually give the board more time to figure out how to.
Whoops.
We lost her.
Susan?
Transition,
Hold on.
right? So she agreed to take on for 6 months.
Hey, Susan?
Yes?
We lost you for about 15 seconds, so can you just back up a little bit to her decision to step in as interim executive?
Oh, I was saying that she came in for 6 months in order to support the transition process. And it actually helped to buy the board a little bit more time in order to navigate leadership transition at the same time as the strategic planning. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so there's this MAG 2.0 idea emerging, which is very substantive in terms of, I wouldn't put it on the minor side of organizational transition. It's quite substantive.
Yes.
And interim executive leadership that's internal to the organization, so an internal board member doing that. And so talk a little bit about how the senior staff started to think about its own leadership proposal in the mix of all that emerging strategy and interim executive leadership.
Yeah, so I mean, at the time we were a very small organization. There were only 5 or 6 of us, and we were looking at our financials. And MAG is a primarily earned income organization, and the massive change that we were thinking about would actually flip us into more of a contributed revenue organization. And as we were looking at the numbers, we were like, well, how is MAG going to pay for this really high caliber seasoned executive director who's not generating any income? And do we even have the lead time to get that person up to speed so that they're generating enough contributed revenue to pay for themselves? And as a staff, we felt that it was possible, but that another option would be for those of us who are staff, Alyssa and myself, to actually take on the leadership position. And in the initial stages, the staff had these conversations without the board present, and we actually talked about all the different staff and who could be in that leadership role, who had qualifications to be a leader, what would it mean to actually do that, who wanted to. And we landed on Alyssa and I because of our complementary skills. And so we presented that with Gail's support. Gail was part of those conversations to the board.
Right. And talk a little bit about the process. I remember you shared with me a literal fishbowl moment where board and staff really shared their fears and feelings about this potentiality. What was that period like, and what did you perceive to be the grappling that was going on with weighing that option? Yes.
So there was this pivotal board meeting where the senior staff were all present and the board was there. And we were trying to figure out what should we do around the next executive director. And of course, this is a board decision. And the board felt very firmly that they wanted to have an external search and have one single director. And we as staff had posed this idea of, no, we should have 2 people who are sharing leadership. And what the board, our consultant, Alan Silva, said, you know what, each of you has a position, but you're not really hearing each other. So let's do a fishbowl where the board witnesses the staff having this conversation about why they want to try out a shared leadership model, and the board can bear witness to that. And then the staff will listen as the board has a conversation about why it should be a single executive director, and then we could come back together and talk about that. And it was a huge pivotal moment because it allowed both of us to see that the biggest challenge facing us from having a shared leadership model as a first choice was the risk that it could possibly fail, right? And so then we were, through that fishbowl, we were able to really pinpoint, okay, here is the risk of trying this out, and how do we address that risk?
Do you remember some of the risk factors that were mentioned, if you're willing to share them?
I think the biggest risk that the board was concerned with is that 2 people who were internal would have been so ingrained in the culture of what MAG had been and our processes that we wouldn't be able to pivot the organization as quickly as it needed to. and that we wouldn't see the programmatic results that the board wanted to see and the staff wanted to see. We both agreed that we wanted to make this change.
Great, terrific. So talk a little bit about, they did ultimately decide to give it a shot, and my interpretation was is they while they came to support it, there were benchmarks set, and it was viewed, at least initially, as an experiment. Is that too strong a word, or?
It was definitely an experiment for the first year. It was a very interesting process because I don't think, as two queer women of color coming into leadership, if we had gone through a traditional transition process, there may have been more support for Alyssa and I in terms of a diagnostic of our skills, what we needed to fill in, and support to do that. We did have some support. Gail moved from being the interim ED to stepping off the board and stepping off the staff and being our coach. And the process of that was really helpful. But ultimately, it was on Alyssa and I to rally our team together to achieve certain benchmarks. We had 3 months benchmarks, we had 6 months benchmarks, and then we had year benchmarks. And every 3 months, we would have a conversation with the board about where we were on our benchmarks and had we achieved the results that we intended to achieve. And it actually worked out great because by the end of the year, it was really clear that this shared leadership model was working. But even in the first year, at any point in those 3 month reviews, we could have said, you know what, it's not working, and we want to go with a more traditional model.
Great, thank you. So just looking at some of the impacts now, what are you, 2 years now in? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 2 years in. I mean, as a witness to it, since we're in similar fields, I can certainly observe externally that you have successfully done, or certainly are in the process of successfully repositioning the organization. And the pivot that you talked about wanting at the organizational transition level, certainly as reflected in staff growth, increased revenue. What would you say about successfully modeling co-directorship? What have you learned so far that is something that we should consider for other organizations who might be looking to consider at least a shared leadership model? What have you learned? What's working? I think that two things are really working well. I mean, the first is that Alyssa and I had a pre-existing relationship. And coming into the process, we got a coach. We still have a leadership coach, not Gail because she's returned to the board. But we got a coach to help retain our relationship and make sure we pay attention to our trust, to conflict, to surfacing conflict, and that we're on the same page together. That was very important. I think the second thing is related to our work on movement networks. So many of our networked organizations have been struggling with leadership challenges as well, in terms of just feeling overwhelmed by just the pressure that's put on one person. And so they have been going through a shared leadership process as well, whether that's a leadership team or it's, you know, multiple directors. And what we witnessed, or what I've experienced in the last 2 years, is that as in a shared leadership model, your organization can do so much more than we could do beforehand. And because we pay attention to being on the same page, Alyssa and I can both be out and talk about our experiences, leadership, about MAG, and grow MAG's relationships and our work in ways that one person could not do. And I think that's really important. I mean, that's why we've grown from basically 5 staff to 12 staff. We've grown from 1 million to 2.2 million, all within less than 2 years. It's because we actually had more capacity together than we did as individuals. Great, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to move us forward, and I know there'll be lots of questions that come back to that story. Before we open it up to questions, Karen and I wanted to share some reflections, because we know there's a lot of board members and senior staff in this webinar thinking, well, what kind of, they both got help. What are our reflections on the use of consultants and how to get help when we widen the lens out to not just executive transition, but organizational transition and evaluating the leadership ethos? Karen, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I think what we've heard both from Susan and from Jennie and Diane is that consultants can play an important role as organizations and leaders are facing transitions. And I think what we heard from both case studies is that they connected with consultants that were willing to meet both the leaders and the organization where that organization and entity needed to be met in terms of that transition. I think what we've heard is that while there are similarities, there's some really great differences between both of these transitions, and both organizations connected with external help and also internal help at MAG, having your board members step off and be an interim leader for a while, that getting that type of additional help is helpful. I think the other piece, and this is interesting, is being open to using consultants in ways other than expected. One of the pieces that I know is when the Children's Inn was working with Tom, we actually started with a perspective on transition, and it was through our dialogue and work with the Children's Inn that we also, as consultants, started to broaden our perspective on how transitions can work for organizations. And I suspect that that's also true at MAG as you were exploring how to really be innovative around a co-leadership model, that working with an external consultant to help you sort of think through those and how to make that work was really important and helpful to the organization. In terms of,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
You want me to pick up?
Sure.
Okay, just on these bottom 2 points, I mean, I think also what we're seeing, as you just shared, even consultants kind of changing their perspective potentially about this particular incident inside the consulting project. So part of what I think we're talking about is that the organizational transition and the conversation about leadership actually probably should affect the approach to transition. And that could be small effects, like, you know, including more staff along with board in the process, for instance, or big steps like deciding not to go external at all, as both of these organizations actually ended up doing. And it's not that we're per se recommending that, but we think the case studies are important because they challenge some of our prevailing assumptions. And in both cases, the organizational transition and the leaders inside the organization had a very good sense of how that transition ought to go, or they figured it out by listening to their own evolving conversation about leadership. And also in the case of Children's Inn, you know, really listening to the outgoing founder, which I know when I came into this work, we were taught that, you know, founder syndrome and they shouldn't influence anything about the search, and, you know, all these so-called truisms that turn us away from the wisdom inside the systems. So I think there's a lot to learn there. And then in the last point, I think that, you know, the skill set of talking about race, of talking about equity, of talking about organizational impact, this may go beyond sort of the traditional process consulting that we think of as associated with executive transition management. When we broaden out to the allied services and to talking frankly about leadership and what we want to see in leadership going forward, we're talking potentially about different consultant skill sets. And you saw in both case studies that the consultant that was hired as MAG's, you know, quote, strategic planner, or in Raffa, quote, transition, ended up doing a lot more and influencing the conversation in a lot of different directions. So it's just food for thought as you're thinking about what kind of support and what kind of skill sets you might need in internal or external consultants. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ruth and ask you to moderate the Q&A and reflection from the participants.
Absolutely. And it may be a little challenging, but I'm going to try to kind of cohere some of these questions. And so I want to go back to you first, Jeanne and Karen, just ask you to restate what the difference is between the two practices that we're recommending need to be attended to in kind of an updated transition process. What are the two practices that we're saying need to be added to what how we've thought about this in the past, and how does that change our approach?
This is Jeanne. So I would say that what we're adding is a deeper analysis of the necessary or ongoing organizational transition. How I would articulate that is beyond what we used to think of as like, we'll do 10 interviews, right before we do the search.
Right.
And not that that's not important. The strategic review inside a search is important, but what I think we're widening out to say the sense making that a board and a staff and other key stakeholders and a good consultant have to do around where is this organization needing to go. That may be a dramatic pivot, like we heard in MAG. It was a less dramatic pivot in Children's Inn, but being very aware of that organizational change, and then adding, and do we want leadership to look the same and practice the same as this in the next 10 years as it was practiced in the last 10 years? And what are our thoughts about that in terms of diversity, in terms of shared leadership, in terms of next generation leadership? Are there things we want to lift up as really essential to the evolution of leadership in our organization? And can we use executive transition in particular to catalyze or amplify our intentions around that?
Okay, so I want to just now go to Susan, go back to Susan and talk a little bit about, were considerations brought up at all about the attitude that people might have externally to your adopting a shared leadership model?
That's a good question.
I'm going to go back.
There were considerations. I don't think people were concerned externally about the shared leadership model not being well received externally. I do think there were concerns about whether we're new executive directors too. So I think there were concerns about whether having new executive directors, would they be well received? Would the field really, would they be able to generate revenue for the organization? So there was a lot of concern about that. There was, I guess on the flip, a certainty that a powerful, well-resourced, seasoned executive director would be kind of like a magic bullet that could bring those things. So
this relates back to the idea of viewing leadership as kind of the sole heroic leader, as opposed to the shared leadership of a collective, which, brings all of its intelligence to the table. And I just wonder, in MAG, besides understanding what those shared leadership models look like, did you also have some elements of the way you functioned pre this transition that aided you in being able to accept a co-directorship?
That's interesting. I mean, I do think we had very strong board staff relationships beforehand. So that was one of the conditions that allowed for this shift. But actually prior...
So let me stop you. What you're saying is board staff relationships besides the executive.
Right, yes.
Okay, which is a very important point, so that the board knew other staff people, knew what you were capable of, had an idea of who you would be in what situations.
Yes, yes.
Great.
That's really interesting. So I want to now go to Children's Inn for a minute and just talk a little bit about, you mentioned that there was a general building out of the senior staff at Children's Inn. And can you talk, because that seems to me in some ways also mimicking this idea of building that larger contingent of leadership at the point that you're investing in internal leadership. It's somewhat similar. So can you talk about what the intention was behind that and how that's progressed a little bit?
Yeah, my predecessor and the model of leadership that was in place under her, which she recognized would not be the model probably of our future, was that all of her, the entire leadership team reported to her. So her span of control was quite large, and some of her direct reports, myself included, also had a very large span of control. So what we did through the consultant is literally unpack the jobs, take each job description and line by line, responsibility by responsibility, mapped it out to the hours that people were in meetings and outside of the organization. And what we very quickly saw was like, whoa, everybody's plates are very, very full. There's not a lot of levels within each department, and maybe we should make some changes there. So she did. She reorganized to 3 direct reports. She reduced from, I think at the time it was 8 direct reports to 3. And then we made some changes within each department, and we realized very quickly both in our finance area and in our development that we needed to add a few people. And in particular, we needed to look at succession within the departments as well. So as we were looking at leadership succession, there were a couple of areas in our organization that really also need succession. Finance in particular. Our CFO has been with the organization from the beginning. So she's luckily fabulous and doing well, but we had no one else to back her up. And so it was through this process that we started to take a look at that as well.
Well, what's interesting about that is you described earlier that the board was going through its own succession planning,
right.
That it was needing to look at its own renewability at the same time. So essentially you have the entire organization looking at, are we structured at this point the way we need to be structured to address our future, right?
Right.
So this was really a much broader effort.
Yes. Yes.
Ruth, could I ask? There's a strategy they use that didn't get spoken to yet, which is in this first bullet here, the creation of the trustee role. Could we touch on that briefly to support your point about board evolution?
Sure. Yes, as we went through the process of actually having term limits, and we were creating a cycle for board members rolling off, we created a trustee position for those folks to go into because they're still very engaged with the mission. They care deeply about it. And we saw that as a way to keep these talented individuals and resources engaged. They attend our annual meeting. And, you know, it's in its first year, so we're still working it out. But that was something we created.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for me, that was key also as a new executive, and the board going through a reorganization, which one thing I didn't make clear is that I actually inherited the board transition, so it wasn't complete when I started. It continued under me, and actually it ends this Thursday at our annual meeting. The last of the 4 founders will transition into a trustee role. So having them close by, even as trustees that I could call on, they had the whole knowledge and history of the organization was also very key to my success. It would have been very difficult, I think, to carry the organization forward in the way the board expected without the trustees having a role to continue to play.
There's a couple of questions in here about what happens if you end up without a lot of time to do a transition, like more immediate than that, or this is your first executive. How should you approach those situations in a way that would reflect this new kind of revelation that this is about more than the executive director?
Well, even if you don't have enough time, you're still going to have to do all the organizational changing. And oftentimes, if you don't have enough time, it's because there's been a crisis, like somebody has passed away, and then you really start to see those organizational issues because you don't even have access to passwords. So I think that the question is buying time, and that's what our board did by having Gail step off the board and become an executive director. But you can also, speaking of consultants, you can also get an interim executive director to give yourself more time. I think
This is Karen. You can also get interim support for your key leadership positions. It doesn't have to be just the executive. You know, there are resources out in the community where you can get an interim CFO or an interim chief development officer. But the other piece, and I think this goes back, Ruth, to your very first question about what's different now. For us, we are really thinking about transition holistically, and that organizations need to engage in the planning, both at the people level and the strategy level and the leadership level, on an ongoing basis. It's so that it's not something that happens only when there's an unexpected departure or a change in leadership, but that really to get the message out to organizations that succession planning and sustainability planning and being thoughtful around leadership and leadership development really should be part and parcel of an organization's life and evolution every day.
And if I just want to add something. The other day, Jenny and I were having a conversation. Probably doesn't realize this, but I gasped because Jenny said, just in passing, well, so for my successor, I will want blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh my God. But I quickly realized, wait, that is such a healthy thing for her to say. That demonstrates to me the sort of thinking that we are really trying to internalize, and she's internalized it.
Yeah.
Well, I want to just, there's a couple of people who brought up, again, doesn't matter if you say things aren't as, they're said to be. The dread founder in these situations, how you deal with the dread founder, and particularly when the founder is making a transition, are there extra steps that need to be taken? Or is it essentially the same set of steps? And are there any additional cautions that you would have?
So I can speak a little bit to that. I
was waiting for Susan to speak about it, because for goodness sake, Susan, aren't you the organization that wrote that piece on founders and
Yes.
and other?
We wrote a piece called Proposal for Two on founder transitions and how to keep founders involved in a shared kind of leadership structure, but we didn't experience it, so that's why I didn't answer.
Sorry, Karen. I'm sorry.
about it.
Did you want to talk to that, Karen?
Yeah, well, what I was going to say is that I think one of the ways our thinking about founders has really evolved is that we are really actively trying to move away from putting founders into one predefined box. Founders, founder executive and founder boards come in all shapes and sizes and varieties. And I don't think there's any one word of wisdom that's going to be applicable to every founder transition. And some of them go really well, as in the case of the Children's Inn. Some of them don't.
So I want to ask there, in both of your cases, I think you mentioned having really clear benchmarks and plans for the first year and a lot of check-ins. Can you talk about what's the dynamic that was created by that? It's not something that would necessarily be set up for a new executive. A lot of times individual executives are brought in with the idea that you know what you're doing, go do it. This feels like a very different dynamic. And can you maybe talk about what that dynamic creates within the organization? Almost reinforces your commitment to the model?
Sure, Susan, I'll speak first if you'd like. So for the Children's Inn, a couple of things I would recommend. First of all, our board certainly was still working on a strategic plan and some strategic priorities, but made the transition the number one priority. So once I was promoted to the CEO position on day one, they decided that this was the priority. They looked at some of the other activities and priorities in the organization and decided, you know what, we're gonna move that timeline, and it was either a low-hanging fruit or it was just something that could wait. We had a couple of of big things going on in the organization, but still the board felt that this transition was a bigger priority than that. And I think that's really important because a lot of time goes into transition. And what that did for me as a new executive, and one of the things we also didn't say is because I was an internal candidate, I also was was also fulfilling my current position as well. So I was still recruiting for the position that I was leaving. So I was actually doing 2 positions for the first 6 months. And so it gave me the time and the space and the support that I needed to start to sort of get my legs, and I say build my house and begin to bring my own team together and think about the end of the future. And because it was so transparent and because it was communicated at all levels, I think the dynamic was, wow, this is really a culture of support. We're all in this together. Our founder knew everything, and now they have me who knows a lot, but really needs a lot of support. And I was very open and honest about that, and I think the board was too. But I think it created just a very supportive dynamic that made the transition a priority. And we set up benchmarks, that's right, along the way. The committee, the onboarding committee was in place for the first 6 months. Mm-hmm. We set 3, 6, 12-month goals and benchmarks, and the goal was to meet all of them, but we certainly reevaluated along the way. And I think that was really very critical to our success.
Great. Susan?
I love what you said about a culture of support. That is absolutely, we should talk about that more. We wouldn't have been successful if it wasn't for the culture of support that was created by our board and our staff together to really buoy up and support and strengthen Alyssa and I as leaders. I realized I used the term benchmarks, and most people think about that as goals that are set, but in MAG's perspective, they were actually experiments. So the board and the staff laid out a set of questions about what it meant to pivot organization. For instance, one of our questions was, can MAG go from being a consultant earned income organization to being a collaborative partner focused on programs, right? That was a question that we posed. And then we broke that down into experiments that could be done in 3-month intervals. And we would do one experiment, and then we would reflect on what did we learn from that experiment, and then we'd set another experiment to continue to explore that question. So we didn't have the same type of, we have to hit, $1 million in X revenue type goal that you would normally have for an executive director. It was much more about, are we doing everything we can to understand this question and how to reposition MAG to start to answer some of these questions.
Fascinating.
So.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. I really do, because it means that you're kind of building the new framework together in the organization, which creates a very, very different dynamic. I want to talk just a little bit, just move it down a little bit and ask you, what does that mean for staff culture generally, and what's information and decision-making staff have access to? Has that changed at all in either one of those organizations?
Has it changed? I think it's just gotten stronger. I will share with you that our staff were part of the transition as well. So each of the individuals on the leadership team, who were my peers at the time, and now some of them are my direct reports, had the opportunity to provide private feedback about me as well as interview me. And several of the individuals on their teams did as well. Through the consultant and through Kathy's work, the entire organization was kept apprised of what was going on. So again, she tried to be really transparent with the timeline and the process. And so by the time I started on my first day, there was just no surprises. And I think, I was just very fortunate to work among a team that of peers that just rose to the occasion. But I think it's because they felt supported and valued and their voice mattered. I think if any one of them had said, whoa, I don't think she's right, or I have some concerns, they would have processed further and taken more time to evaluate me. And I think that's really important. So everybody really felt like they had a voice in the organization. And I've carried that value forward.
Susan?
I think for us, so we did have a culture of respecting people's input, whether, staff and board, and people had really good communications. When Alyssa and I became co-directors, we had to be really clear about what does that mean for decision making. And we actually developed a decision making tree to clarify when do you need to come to Alyssa and Susan for decisions, and when does staff have the authority to make their own decisions, and what are the criteria by which staff can make their own decisions. And we are pretty transparent and constantly talk about how, for us, shared leadership means that we are going to be very, very clear with folks about when decisions are shared across multiple staff and are with board, and when decisions are going to be more of the traditional top-down. And so we talk about what does it mean to be able to shift between the two of those, and sometimes it gets messy. But fortunately, we can keep going back to our decision-making tree and say, hey, are we following this? Are we not following it? Are we using the right decision-making? It actually takes a lot of time to talk about it.
Well, I want to thank, before I turn this back to Jeanne and Ken, I just want to thank you guys for making yourselves so transparent to the outside world, because this is how we're going to learn from each other about new kind of updated practices like this. I do want to say that one of the things that really strikes me about people's responses to a shared leadership model is that there tends to be like this idea that it's riskier than adopting an individual leader from outside. And I don't believe there have been any studies that would prove otherwise, but I would be willing to bet that is not true. That is a very big bet to make on one person who you haven't observed over a long period of time. To entrust your organization's culture and future to them with the mitigating influence of the board if they're there in that capacity. But I just wanted to say that because it's always struck me as being a kind of an ironic frame, that we would feel more comfortable in trusting ourselves to one flawed individual, because we're all flawed, rather than some kind of collective intelligence. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jeanne and Karen, and for a kind of last few words and a checkout.
Great, thank you. This is Jeanne. Well, you just said a lot of what I might say, but I think, again, to me, it's even if we stay with a single executive, I think we hear in Jennie's words and in her spirit a sense that how we do leadership is evolving. And so I think for me, the most important takeaway is that we're going to underserve the sector, both at the individual organizational level, but I'm also concerned about the sector writ large. If we conduct individual executive transitions without connecting that process to the larger discourse around leadership. And we could see how that would happen for some of the reasons that came up in your chat box around, now we need a leader. and there's rightfully a lot of concern about financial sustainability, about performance, about the board's own leadership, as some of those people are going to turn off, and the responsibility, the genuine responsibility that a board feels. So those forces are so powerful, and rightfully so. And if we don't include in that conversation our aspirations around how leadership is conducted, I worry that we'll get consumed with those fears and concerns and not use the opportunity to push forward with our values towards the kind of leadership we want to see in the sector.
Great. And I think for me, the main takeaway is just as the sector is growing and evolving, so is our understanding around leadership and organization transition and the leadership ethos. And I think the real fear around something like co-leadership is that it's simply different from what we've known in the past. And the real opportunity is to really think about the possibilities that really work for the organization and the board and the staff and the volunteers and the community that organization represents, and to be a little risk-taking going forward, and share that risk with your community of stakeholders, and find new ways of advancing your mission and new leadership models. I think that's the wave of the future.
Great. Do you two have anything to add, Jennie?
Oh,
No?
I think they've said everything that we could say.
I didn't want to cut you out at the very end. Okay, we are going to be pursuing this topic over the next year or so, and really trying to illustrate in other ways how we can begin to develop shared leadership inside of our organizations, and that leadership which is really educated about what it is that we're facing in developing the best possible future for our constituencies that we serve and the organizations that we are a part of. And that's the point. All of this talk about leadership really has to do with how much collective power, influence, and smarts can we develop as each nonprofit organization. So with that, I will say goodbye and join us next time, please, all of you. And thank you very much, Jeanne and Karen and the organizations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth.